All right, you're good to go.
All set?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Diana Nichols, and we're going to talk about CSS today. I have to tell you, though, that the description of Meetup was a little misleading. Not intentionally, but today we're only going to talk about one of the preprocessors, less, because I don't know much about SASS. And that's probably okay because they're very, very similar in the ways that I'm going to talk about today. How many of you have ever used less or SASS in your workflow? Okay, 2 people. Well, good. Then maybe the rest of you can learn something. Do any of the rest of you know anything about them? You ever seen them? Raise your hand. Okay, a few more. I use less, and I use it consistently throughout my workflow, and if you told me I had to go back to pure CSS, I would probably cry because it saves me so much time and effort. It's a fabulous tool. So what is a CSS processor? Essentially, it's another language that extends CSS. It lets you do things with CSS that you can't do natively. Most notable, you can use variables. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that's so critical or why it's so handy to do. That's probably the biggest reason that I started using less. Nesting and operations are bonuses. They're also very handy, but not as useful, I don't think, as using variables. And then also the compiler that I use for less checks my script to make sure I haven't made any mistakes. I haven't declared variables that weren't there. I haven't made mistakes in my syntax, and that's really important for a typist like myself. So, when it comes to preprocessors, there are a number of them. Less and SASS are the most popular, the most prominent. Those are the ones that you'll hear the most about. And they do pretty much the same thing, especially on the basic level. I don't use SASS, so I can't really speak to it very well, except that what I understand about it is that when you get into the more advanced functions, most of which I don't use anyway, SASS does more. It has more power if you're really wanting to do some complicated things with your CSS. Okay, so here's some things that you can do with less. You can set variables. For example, I want to use the same blue throughout my site. I mean, that's just good practice, right? You want all your blues to be the same. So I set that as a variable at the beginning, and then I call it, so my blue is always blue. It's always the same blue. I can do computations. I can say, I want to darken my blue or lighten my blue by a certain percentage, and there again, I've got another variable, and if I change the blue, I don't have to change the second color. It just does it automatically because it's computing it. You can compute sizes. If I say that I want my box size to be 30 pixels, and I want my padding to be 3 pixels, then then when I change my box to 40 pixels, and I want my padding to be 4, I do that with a computation. You'll see that in a minute. Nesting parameters, that's another big one. How many times have you typed out, well, let me ask you this, how many of you actually write CSS? Not modify it or read it, but write it. Okay, well, this probably isn't a big deal for you then, but it is for me, especially if you have something like a navigation bar. You have a div that's called nav, and then you have inside divs, and then you have list elements and A's and all that, and every time you target one of those little things down there, you have to type the outside div and then the inside div, and you end up typing that 20 different times. But with nesting, you only have to type it once, and I'll show you that in a little bit too. You can import your styles and fonts. We all know that it's not good practice, right, to put links to style sheets and outside fonts in your header. Does everybody know that? Say yes. Okay, so your choices are, you can put them in your functions file, or you can import them into your style sheet. For fonts, it makes a lot more sense to me to put them into the style sheet, because then all my font information's in the same place. You can actually create your own classes and then reuse them. I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. It's easier to explain when you see the examples. And you can create classes that have variables. Plus, you can do everything with less that you can do with CSS. And that's a considerable number of things. So let's start with the easiest thing, and the killer thing as far as I'm concerned, defining variables. This goes at the top of my less file, and I have defined these colors for my site. And if the client says I want that to be a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, no, I don't like gold, I'd rather have green, all I have to do is change this, and I don't have to change it anywhere else. So that's awesome. Yes, Aaron?
Can you make it a little bigger?
Yes.
Control plus or whatever. Because of the contrast or lack of contrast, it makes it a little harder to read. Thank you.
How's that? Yeah, this screen size is a little difficult to work with sometimes. But you can see the advantage to this, right? You're using the same gold and the same blue throughout your site. Well, when the client changes his mind, or you change your mind and you want to change it to a different shade or a different color, you only have to change it one place. Same with your fonts. You don't have to declare those anywhere else except here. And then I'll show you in a minute how you refer to that. Can also declare a variable to be equal to another variable. So head color, which is what I call my H1 tags, is now gold. And if I change it, there again, all my headings change. The difference with SASS and less, SASS uses $signs, just like PHP and JavaScript and other languages. Less uses @signs to denote a variable. We're not sure exactly why, but that's the way it is. And it's not hard to learn that. It's not hard to remember it. So this is how we use variables. Here's my body. I've declared all these variables at the top of my less file. And now I go down and my body is background. It's a variable. HTML uses the body font and the text color. All my H1s are head font and head color. And my A's are link color. Now, where this really gets handy for me is I start with the same starter style sheet on every site I build. So for this copy here never changes. All I do is change my variables. And I never have to go in here and change any of this. Say, wow, that's pretty cool. Okay, now, because less is an actual language that has to be compiled into CSS, I forgot where I was going with that sentence, but less is a language that then compiles into CSS. So when I run this through my compiler, this is what I get out. Oops. Okay, well, that's not true. That should actually be a number there. Didn't prove that carefully. But Ignore that one, and this is the rest of it. This is what it will actually look like as CSS. It takes my variables and replaces them in the CSS file, which then is just like any other CSS file. Okay. Here's something else that can be quite handy, especially if you're working with colors and different site widths, is computations. We can darken or lighten colors by a percentage, and you just play with this. But it keeps it in the same hue, but just a darker or lighter version. That's handy for highlighting or for borders. You can also add colors together. And you just have to kind of play with this to see what it does, but essentially that right there will just take 444, which is a very dark gray, put it over the top of your blue, and you end up with a new color that's a very dark blue. Yeah.
Right now, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. You said you're adding that in layers over the blue?
Yes, well, it does a computation. It adds your blue, whatever value that is, to 444, which is a very dark gray. So it just makes it a very dark blue.
Oh, okay.
Pretty cool, huh?
That is.
I didn't know you could do such a thing.
That's
It's
awesome.
magic. The other place where computations are very handy for me is with widths, with sizes of things. If your full site width is 960 and then you want 250% columns, you only have to change this one variable, and then you can get half of that by dividing it by 2, or dividing it by 3, or multiplying it times 0.3, or whatever it is you want.
Do you define your media queries like that, or do you do it somewhere?
I'm sorry?
Do you define your media queries kind of like that, or for each device, or is it?
I don't know. I use Bootstrap, which does that a different way, but you could. This I would use for different column widths, for sidebars and whatever. Okay. Any questions so far? Is everybody following this?
Where do you get your processor, and how does that work?
We're gonna get to that at the end. We're gonna talk about how to implement this after you get all excited about all the stuff it can do.
Okay.
Aaron?
One thing I would note is that if you don't know any less or SASS, you can put just regular CSS in there too. So
Oh,
if
yeah.
you don't know, if you're new at it, you just want to do certain pieces of it, you don't have to like rewrite anything. You can put regular CSS, take your CSS file, put it in the less file without changing anything, and it'll compile fine. So you can just go in and change certain variables you
Right.
can change. So,
If you only want to change one variable, or add one variable or something, you're absolutely right. You don't have to write with any of these functions. Do you have a question?
Yes, is there a simple table or something that defines this pound 444 to do something when I put a plus in front of it? I mean, is it adding, subtracting? I see a plus 5%.
It's adding it.
It's adding.
It's adding it.
What, how do I know what that 444, where do I get that?
That's a hex number. It's a color. It's a hex color.
You're gonna peek and poke it into the memory. What? Where would I get the value?
A lot of websites can show you, yeah.
Yeah.
There's
No,
16.7 million, so it'd be too big to have like a printable table, but yeah, you can go online and say, what color is 444? And it'll show you, there's what it looks like.
Right. Like 000, pound 000 is black. Pound FFF is white. And there's everything in between. It's hexadecimal numbers.
It's important if you're an artist.
Well, yeah, it's important if you're a designer. And hexadecimal numbers is what the internet primarily uses. You can use RGB numbered colors, but most people use hex numbers. But you can find charts anywhere, just Google.
Well, you got your color picker up there too, so you can sample if you had a color you were looking
Right.
at, or a site that you were looking at.
Thank you. I can actually do that. I can show you that color right there is D. And this blue one is, no. Let's see. Come on. Huh, interesting. Okay. That's not F7. I don't know why it's, I don't know why it's doing that. It's giving me only grayscale colors. Isn't that interesting? I wonder if that's a setting.
You got up there in your toolbar, how do you do that?
That's an add-on for Firefox called Color Picker. And it's really, really handy tool for when you're designing and you see a color that you like or you want to copy a color. I don't know why it's not working.
I have found that little X is not very accurate. Sometimes you gotta move it completely off the color to grab the color.
Yeah, it's only giving me grayscale
Yeah.
colors, which is bizarre. It's probably a setting I've
Because
got.
the lighting's pretty dark here.
Yeah, I don't,
Yeah, I'm clicking on your page and it's showing me the blue, so.
yeah, I know, I
With
don't.
the same add-on.
It's probably a setting that, I don't know. Doesn't matter. But at any rate. Okay, where did I go? Oh, okay. Yes, but hexadecimal colors are standard colors. And if you just Google that, you can find all kinds of charts that will tell you what the hexadecimal numbers are for certain colors. Okay? And, you know, basically anything that is, like for example, this is a blue. And I just know that because I know that, but you wouldn't necessarily need to know that. I know that anything that is, that's actually a shortcut. It stands for 444444 because all numbers have 6 characters in them. But if they're all the same, you can shortcut it this way. Anything from 000 to FFF is grayscale if they're all the same numbers. Like F8, F8, F8 is a grayscale. Too much information.
It's a decimal.
Sorry.
I know what you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll move on now. Okay. This is where it gets kind of interesting. This is where you can define your own custom classes. And this right here is one of the major reasons why you want to. Because in order to make a gradient that works well on all the major browsers, you have to type all of this stuff. And if you have a bunch of buttons or boxes or menu bars or whatever that have gradients in them, you have to type this every single time. That's kind of a pain. However, with less, I made a class called my gradient. And when I want to use it on a button, that's what I type. So I type this one time, and now I can use it for buttons, I can use it for boxes, I can use it for anything I want. What happens is, I should have showed you.
I like that much less copy pasta.
Yes. Well, less copy pasta is always a good thing, right? So when this compiles, I should have shown you that, it will take all of this, it'll say button, and it will put all of this stuff in the CSS under button, just automatically. So, one more, and this is the other one that I use, and I use this on every single project. I define a class called round, which rounds corners. And the difference here is I'm using a variable that has a default. The radius being how much I want to round the corners. My default is 5 pixels. And my class does again the border radius for all 3 major browsers. And I call it like this, just round. Now because this is what's called a parametric mixin, Or in other words, it has variables, it functions like a function instead of like a class. So because it has a variable, because it has the brackets here, you have to use the brackets when you call it. If, like here, I call it without putting anything in there, it's going to use the default 5 pixels.
Can you kind of go back over that again,
Okay?
please?
Okay. The class up here
Mm-hmm.
is just a class.
Right, that's
It's just
just,
plain old class. Well, this one has a variable attached to it, which means that I can call round with 5 pixels, or 10 pixels, or 100 pixels. I can change this because it's a variable.
okay. And
Okay,
that's
because sometimes I want my corners to be just slightly rounded, and sometimes I want them more rounded.
Okay.
Okay, so I put a variable in there. And it takes this variable and uses it in the class. So when I call it like this, it's going to use the default 5 pixels. If I call it like this, it's going to use 10 pixels. And I'll show you what this is what it puts out. This is the CSS that comes from using it those two ways. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I just needed to see you click again.
Yeah. Now, this allows you to use the same functionality, but change the parameters in your code, because sometimes you don't want everything to be the same. You want it to be mostly the same, but with some changes. Okay. Are we going too fast for anybody? Because now this is kind of building up, it's getting a little more complicated. So here's another example of a class. This time I'm going to have 2 variables. Like, I'm not just limited to one. I'm going to define a class called my box, and it's going to have background color and a border color. So I can have a box that keeps all of these parameters except for the color. And also here I'm using variables for the colors. These go along with my site colors. But because they're variables, I can change them. This is how I call it. Either like this, which uses the defaults, or like this, where I change the box from gold to blue. Following?
I've got a question.
Yes.
Okay, so when you call it, you know, in your code there, and it goes, in the parentheses, you change the color. Now, how does it know that it's changing the background and not the border color? Is it because of the order?
The order.
Okay.
You can specify that here if you want to.
Okay.
I don't
You'll
usually,
just
it's
go
just
in
easier to
order.
keep them in order.
Okay. That makes sense.
And this is what outputs for both of those. Everything is the same except for the colors. And there again, look at all that typing I just saved myself. From that to that. Okay. This is something that I actually just learned when I was researching this, so I'm very excited. There's a command called arguments, which is magic. When I write borders, for example, and some other things, I use the shortcut version, which is the size, the type, and the color all in one line. It's so much easier than writing border color, border size, blah, blah, blah. So, Les will do that for you. If you put your parameters, the width, the type, and the color in order in your parameters, and then you call it with this magic command called, or magic variable called arguments, it will output that for you in the shortcut version, just like that. Say, wow.
I don't think I understand.
Yeah, I don't see how that's saving time there.
How's it saving time?
It
Well,
seems like
it's
you're typing
probably
more.
not saving time in typing.
Okay.
Sorry. It's probably not saving time in your typing. It makes, but one of the reasons I love less is it makes the CSS more readable. And that to me is a lot more readable than 3 border statements.
Okay, I'll agree with that.
Okay. Importing. We talked about it. You can do importing a number of different ways. I like to import my fonts and any other supplemental style sheets that I have into my less, because then it's all in one place and I don't have to go looking at my functions file when I want to change my Google fonts.
So does that mean we don't have to unqueue? I
No.
thought we were, okay.
No, it just imports it into this. Now you do have to unqueue your regular style sheet, but if you're importing another style sheet into this one, you don't have to unqueue it, because it becomes one style sheet. And that's also good for best practices. Okay. More operations. Another example, not using colors. I want to create a square that's 3 EMs. So I can declare that the width and the height are the same, obviously. And there's my padding. It's 1% of whatever the size of the square is. I don't use that one that often, but it's something you can do. This is what that outputs. And if you want all your squares to be consistent in their design, it's a very useful tool. A lot of the reason we use CSS is for consistency, right? We want things to look consistent throughout the site. Same colors, same types of designs, same kind of spacing, and less just makes that easier. Something else I learned that I wasn't aware of is that you can put text into variables. Like if you're using hard-coded URLs in your CSS, you can put that into a variable and use it like that, and only have to change it once. Aaron, how did you say you were using those?
I use images. All of my images go in a variables.sass file or less file, whichever you're using. And so anytime when I'm going in and modifying an image or whatever, I don't have to type in the whole URL. I just type in like header background or whatever. It just makes it, having all of the links to all of the images in one snippet of CSS just makes it easier. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is time savings in terms of writing stuff, part of it is readability, part of it is organization. And I'll show you one of my favorite parts when we get a little bit farther along. Nesting. This is another one that I'm not so sure it's a time saver as much as it is an organization tool. It's a lot more readable, makes a lot more readable to my eye anyway. A has a lot of permutations that you generally have to define. Your hover and your focus states, your visited state, could be other things, but we combine that all in one statement by nesting. This and hover and focus assumes the A. So it's like putting another A hover statement. Yes?
What's a focus state?
Focus state, that's when you like click on it and you're now focused on it, or in a form when you tab down to it. Most commonly you'll see a little dotted outline around like your buttons or something when they're focused on.
So like the active?
I honestly don't know if it's the same as active. Does anybody else know the answer to that?
I think they're the same, but I don't know.
I would think so.
Yeah, I feel okay now.
I would say yes.
Okay.
We're gonna go with
one thing
yes.
One thing I do say is that does save a ton of time for me is the nesting, because if you're doing nav, ul, li, a, you know, every time, if I need to go back and now I need to target not just the nav, ul, li, a, I need to do the nav, ul, li, a, hover. You know, I don't have to type that in over and over again. I hit tab and then type in, you know, hover. You know, so that to me is one of the time savers for me. So.
It is when it comes to typing,
When you're
especially
typing
in
it out,
navigation.
yeah.
Because navigation tends to get very precise with all of its various pieces. Does everybody understand this? So here we have the whole thing that's A, and then this pertains to hover and focus, and this pertains to visitor. Just like nesting anything else. Got it? What did I do there? Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to show you the magic, or what the magic looks like. This is, hold on a second, get a little bigger. Now I have my own way of writing code. To me, it's more readable to write it like this than to indent and do all the spacing and all that. I like, it's just more readable. It's how I started doing it, so it's how I write CSS code. So this is a sample sheet. At the beginning, I've got my import statement. Here I've defined all my variables. I've defined my two classes that I normally use. And I do variables for my gradient so that I can have a blue gradient, a gray gradient, whatever. There's my round statement. Those go in pretty much every style sheet I do. And then here's how I write my CSS. And 9 times out of 10, I don't change much of this at all because it's using variables. Background is the page color. H1s are head color, head font. Body is body font, text color. My A's are, colors are defined in the top. Here I'm using round for my buttons. Using the blue again. I use a lot of variables. And like I said, if I want to go back and change, I go back and change them. So this is what my less file looks like. And a lot of programmers would tell me that's quite ugly. That's okay. Once it gets compiled, look what I get. This beautiful, all the spacing is perfect. This is the way, you know, this looks beautiful to other developers, and it's just, it does all of that wonderful stuff magically for me. That's a huge bonus for me. Second bonus is that this compiler can also minify it. Everybody know what minification is? No. Okay, minification essentially takes out all the extraneous spaces out of your code. And while it's not very easy for humans to read, it's a small advantage in page load speed. The bigger your files are, the more advantage you have in speed. It's a preferred way to present your scripts and CSS files. But there again, that's a bonus thing. I'm going to show you how this works now. So I start off with this kind of a file. And in the background of my computer, I have this little, I have this compiler running. The one I use is called WinLess. There are a number of others, and quite honestly, I use this one because it's the one I know, the one I have, and I haven't taken time to investigate any others. I will though, because as Aaron pointed out, there's something it doesn't do that I want it to do. So essentially, I just downloaded this file. It runs in the background of my computer. I tell it, I don't know if I can make that bigger. I can't. But I tell it to look in certain folders and watch for less files and make them into CSS files. So every time I make a change on my less file, this little program automatically, without my even thinking about it, compiles it into a changed CSS file.
So when you hit, when it's like when you save your less file, you're saving and compiling at the same time.
Exactly. This is doing it for me. It's also validating. If I make a mistake in my less file, I put in a colon instead of a semicolon or something, like things that we do, it tells me and it won't compile it. So it's validating it as well. If I want it to minify, it will do that just by clicking that little button. So this works like autosave. Every time I save the less file, my CSS file is updated.
Can I ask you a question about notification?
Yes.
Okay, so when you're working on your, like, say you're working on a site, you've got the style sheet, you've minified it, and now you want to go in there and work on it. Do you keep a unminified version, and then you adjust that, minify it, and upload it? Is that
I
what
do,
you do?
yes. It's just like if you're working in less and you have your CSS file and you change your CSS file, the less file didn't change. So now you've got
Okay, can you say that again?
the less file and the CSS file can get out of sync if you change your CSS file without changing the less file. Same thing with minification. You can't go backwards. You can't unminify. You can't create. You can't un-CSS back to left.
So you need to keep parallel files, basically, and do your changes in the style sheet, minify, then FTP, and then do it like that in your workflow. Okay.
And for practical purposes, the only time you need minification is when you go live with something. You don't, well, that's a debate for another day.
And some of the caching plugins will do it for you regardless.
Right, right. But you always want to keep an unminified version because minification just makes it really hard to read, especially if it's like most CSS files, it's this long. The same with JavaScript. You can't read it once it gets minified because you have no guides for your eyes. I always keep less files and unminified CSS files. When I go live with a project, I upload both of those to the site just as a way to store them. But in case for some reason I lose my copy, because once you've done something in less, you can make changes to the CSS, but then it's just easier.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Since I don't code CSS from scratch,
Mm-hmm.
is there an advantage for me to use less?
There could be. If you have depends on whether it would be more trouble. It depends on your workflow, I would say. If you had a style sheet for a theme that you had bought or whatever, and you wanted to change the colors throughout, might be the easiest thing for you to do would be to search and replace in a text editor. Or it could be that you'd want to make a less file and go through and create variables. Depends on your workflow, depends on, I use it an awful lot because I reuse my style sheets. If, for example, you use the same theme over and over again, but you change certain parts of it, it might be worth your while to create a less version of your style sheet and put the variables in for the things you change all the time, and then just change those.
Also, more and more themes are coming with less in SASS files, it's just no one knows what they are, so they don't use them.
That's true.
If I'm just using a template that somebody created, does it matter to my CSS if they use less to create it?
No. Makes no difference how it got there. But once the CSS is written, makes no difference how it got there. It's all the same stuff. Anything else? Is anybody convinced and wants to get started using it today? April.
New stuff.
New joins, yeah.
You said you've settled in on Winless. What are some of the other compilers out there?
Yeah, what is the piece it doesn't do that
Right.
Aaron?
What it doesn't do is, you know, when you go to inspect element and it tells you what line in your CSS file, it doesn't correlate to your less file. It correlates to the compiled CSS.
Right.
And because of the way it compiles, line 10 in my less file might be line 25 in my CSS file.
Okay, but other software can get around that?
They create a map file.
Other compilers do give you that information.
So your browser will recognize the .map file, and it'll tell you which line it is in your.
That's the one disadvantage
Gotcha.
to Winless.
And there's about 7 or 8 different compilers out there. There's probably 3 that are open source, and I think CodeKit is one, Compass is one, and you can use Garage or Gulp too if you do command line stuff. But
So Chrome looks for the map file. It knows to look for the map file.
that's smart enough. Yep.
Cool. Yeah, the other one that you hear a lot about is Simple Less. Haven't used it, but it's fairly highly rated. I don't know if it does the map. This is one of those tools that I really haven't thought about in a long time, so I'm using what works. But now that I've done a little bit of research for this talk, I'm going to investigate some of the others. Let's see. Doesn't specifically say that they do the maps. Also, some of the compilers are for Mac, some are for Windows, so you need to kind of look at that as well. One called Koala. I was looking at this one earlier. I like the name.
So it's the only way you get the .com.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And as I said, pretty much all this stuff applies to SASS as well. I have been told by people who know that, or who should know, that less is slightly easier to learn, but that slightly easier might be 10 or 20 minutes, so not really. It's kind of a matter of what you get used to. I know it seems in my reading that most of the real developers, the real hardcore developers, are using SASS these days, and I think that may be because it has some more advanced functions, or it might be the fad of the year, I just don't know. Both of them will do the job, and for my purposes, less works just fine.
Is that a generated user icon, a GUI? Is that what that is?
What?
GUI, what does that stand for?
GUI?
Graphical user interface.
Yes, graphical user interface. It means you don't have to type in command line commands to get the computer to do what you want. You can point and click. Essentially is what it means. It's what we didn't have until Windows 3.
They say it's Windows instead of DOS.
Yeah.
A GUI used to mean sprite. You could make your own sprite that would go across your screen. Is that what that does?
Is what does?
A graphic user interface. Does that create sprites?
I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Okay, don't worry
I
about
think
that.
a graphical user interface is anything that uses graphics to interact with your computer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, a sprite could be a form of that, but in the broadest term, it's just a graphical interface.
Okay.
You see this command prompt here? I can navigate around my computer using this, which is essentially DOS, disk operating system from Microsoft. I can do almost anything with this that I can do with my browser, but I have to know the commands, I have to type them in the right order, and this is how we used to deal with computers before we had the GUIs. So anything that's not this is essentially a GUI. Does that sort of make sense? I think I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
And they pointed out there, because there's a lot of last lesson SASS stuff that is not GUI. That is command line, grunt, and all that kind of stuff. So this is pointing out, hey, this is a point and click, easier to use version compared to some of the other stuff.
Exactly.
That's their
Exactly.
selling point here.
Good point. Right. That's why they're talking about it, because you can compile this, and a lot of hardcore developers or developers who use command line a lot more than I do compile it that way.
Crunch.
Yeah, there's another one called Crunch, which I haven't looked at, but yeah. I mean, I kind of like their website, so I might try that one too. So, anything else? If anybody wants to get started with this or wants to figure out how to put it into your workflow, I'd be happy to help, answer questions, whatever. That's about it.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
And we'll have links to your round table notes up on the website.
Okay.